This video tutorial is about the structure of the human brain and the function of its parts. You need to be aware of the gross structure of the human brain and the functions of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. On the slide in front of you, you should be able to see a series of different brains. Have a go at matching each brain with the correct species. So we've got a dolphin, rabbit, frog, monkey, human, camel, baboon, and cat brain on the slide. Pause the video now if you would like more time, as I'm about to display the answers. Now we're going to focus on the human brain. The human brain is on average 1.4 kilograms in mass, making it about 2% of the total body weight in a human. It consumes an incredible 25% of the body's oxygen supply and 70% of the body's glucose supply. It has about 100 billion neurons within it. And those 100 billion neurons make approximately 1 quadrillion connections. The brain acts as the main coordinating center for nervous activity. It receives and interprets information from the sense organs and then transmits information to effectors. We have various different techniques that we can use now to image the brain. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a photo of the brain. Images like that can be taken during autopsies. The central image is taken from an MRI of the brain, MRI standing for magnetic resonance imaging. So MRI is used to investigate the structure of the brain, and there's actually a specialist version of MRI called functional MRI, which has been developed to allow studies of the brain during activity. And finally, on the right-hand side is a CT scan of the brain. And CT scans are used, essentially they use a series of X-rays to create detailed 3-dimensional images of the inside of the body, and obviously can be used on the brain. So here is a diagram of the brain. Are you aware of the names of any different parts of the brain? See if you can pause the video now and label this diagram of the brain. We're going to learn about some of the different areas of the brain. So first of all, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is concerned with the higher brain functions, such as decision-making, reasoning, planning, and consciousness of emotion. It's also concerned with forming associations and with ideas. So it includes the primary motor cortex, which has neurons that connect directly to the spinal cord and the brainstem, and from there to the muscles. It sends information to the body via motor neurons to carry out movements. And the motor cortex also stores information about how to carry out different movements. Here we've got the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is concerned with orientation, movement, sensation, calculation, and some types of recognition and memory. The occipital lobe, or the visual cortex, is concerned with the processing of information from the eyes, including vision, colour, shape recognition, and perspective. We've got the cerebellum. We'll speak about that in a little bit more detail later on. The spinal cord, the brainstem, and the temporal lobe, where the temporal lobe is concerned with the processing of auditory information, so hearing, sound recognition, and speech. It's also involved in memory. This diagram is a cross-section of the brain. Here we have the cerebral cortex on the outside, the corpus callosum, which we'll look at in a little bit more depth as well a bit later on, the thalamus, which you might have come across in different modules studied within the A-level course, the cerebellum, which we'll look at in more detail in a bit, and the pons, the medulla oblongata, the midbrain, the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and finally the ventricle. You need to be able to label up the brain, so you should be able to locate each of these different structures. Just as a sort of brief overview of each of these, the cerebral cortex, sensory information such as sort of vision, smell, and hearing are processed here, as well as higher cognitive functions. The corpus callosum is responsible for connecting the left and right hemispheres to coordinate information. The cerebellum is largely involved in fine motor control, posture, and balance. And the pons links the medulla with the thalamus. The medulla oblongata controls breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, reflex actions such as vomiting and sneezing. The midbrain is involved in the control of visual and auditory systems and also controls body movement. The pituitary gland produces hormones that control growth, sexual development, and metabolism. And the hypothalamus is responsible for homeostasis, control of body temperature and osmoregulation, and also secretes hormones. These images here are just showing the two cerebral hemispheres. So on the left-hand side, you can see the brain is in these two parts, and also the cross-section just showing the distribution of white and grey matter. So the white matter is composed of axons, and that lies below the grey matter, which in this particular image is stained blue. You should also be able to spot out the corpus callosum, which is a sort of band of white material in the middle there, connects the length of the brain. It's connecting the two different hemispheres. So first of all, the cerebellum then. The cerebellum is a highly convoluted area of the brain with a really, really large surface area. It controls voluntary movements such as learning, memory, personality, and conscious thought. And it contains the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortexes of both the two cerebral hemispheres. It also includes the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, and the olfactory bulb. So we have two cerebral hemispheres. They are heavily folded, and it sort of consists of grey matter. And each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So your left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. And these two hemispheres are linked by the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is the major connection between the two hemispheres, and it enables communication between the two. There are instances where the corpus callosum will be cut, and this was something that used to be done to help people with severe epilepsy to control the sort of epileptic fits that they had. So their corpus callosums were severed, and as a result, the two hemispheres work independently of one another. There are some extraordinary videos that I would highly recommend you watch on YouTube of split brain patients, something you would study at university if you were going off to study psychology, and certainly if you do sort of medicine or biology. The cerebellum, shown here in orange, so that controls unconscious functions such as posture, balance, and non-voluntary movements. It contains over half of all the neurons in the brain, and it receives information from the sensory receptors, so the retina, the inner ear, and spindle fibers in the muscles. Next, we'll focus in on the medulla oblongata. So this is responsible for controlling non-skeletal muscles, so the cardiac and smooth muscles, and it sends action potentials out through the autonomic systems. The medulla oblongata contains the cardiac center, controlling heart rate, the vasomotor center, so that's for circulation and blood pressure, the respiratory center, controlling controlling sort of the rate and depth of breathing, and it's also responsible for receiving information and coordinating vital functions by negative feedback. The hypothalamus has two centres, one parasympathetic and one sympathetic. It controls complex patterns of behaviour, such as sleeping and feeding. It monitors blood plasma composition, so, for example, the amount of water and glucose in your blood, and is involved in temperature regulation as well as producing hormones. It acts as an endocrine gland. Finally, the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is sometimes known as the master gland. It is responsible for controlling the release of hormones from all other glands. It's found at the base of the hypothalamus, and it's the size of like a little green pea. It produces, or the anterior produces, 6 main hormones, including FSH, which is involved in the control of the menstrual cycle. And then the posterior of the pituitary, so the back, stores and releases hormones made by the hypothalamus. So, for example, ADH. Just to finish off then, we're going to look at the tissue fluid of the brain, which is protected by the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier restricts the passage of pathogens, the diffusion of solutes in the blood, and large or hydrophobic molecules. It restricts the passage of them into the cerebrospinal fluid, while allowing the diffusion of hydrophobic molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hormones, and small polar molecules. So the purpose of the blood-brain barrier is to protect against circulating toxins or pathogens that could cause brain infections, whilst at the same time allowing vital nutrients to reach the brain.